Hello and welcome to another video from your Albuquerque Public Schools Behavior Support Specialists. My name is Molly Keys, and today we're talking about writing objectives to support social and emotional learning integration into our daily classroom lessons. First off, we will start by reviewing the bare bones basics of SEL and the CASEL competencies. Then, we're going to talk about what it means to integrate SEL into our work, before we cover the meat of the presentation by looking at how we can use objectives as a way of bringing SEL into our work on a daily basis. Let's get started. I recently read a speech given by Woodrow Wilson on the topic of education. In this speech, he goes into great detail about his ideals for public education in America, but it is in the very beginning of his speech that he says this: "You cannot develop human nature by devoting yourselves entirely to the intellectual sides of it. Intellectual life is the flower of a thing much wider and richer than itself." That quote stuck with me because in our work on SEL, the one comment that we've received most often from teachers is that there's no time and no room for SEL in their classrooms, or that it doesn't fit into their subject area. Part of why I made this video for you is to prove that there is space in your classroom for SEL, and that it is vitally important to integrate SEL into that space in order to help your students truly flourish in the educational environment. On top of that, as we continue to plan and consider what a hybrid teaching model will look like at any level, we know one thing to be true. Our students will need to relearn what it is to be a student at school. SEL is the key to that transition. With that in mind, let's refresh our memory on what SEL is and what it looks like in the classroom. SEL stands for Social and Emotional Learning. It is essentially a collection of learning and life skills that allow us to develop into productive, caring adults. Recent research from CASEL, the nonprofit organization that has championed the application of SEL in schools, has demonstrated that many employers express an interest in hiring individuals with skills associated with SEL over applicants who solely possess technical knowledge and ability. This is because SEL skills are based around problem solving, building and maintaining relationships, forming competent teams, being aware of our own strengths and weaknesses, and being self-motivated, among other skills. Here I've included the famous CASEL competency wheel. This graphic is a basic outline of the SEL competencies that we use in APS: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. Within each of these competencies is a set of skills that clarify what our students need to be able to do in order to meet each of these competencies effectively. When we're planning SEL instruction in the classroom, there are two ways that we can go about it. First is the explicit method, in which we're teaching lessons that are dedicated to specific SEL competencies. This is a focused time for development of new skills. In many classrooms, this kind of learning is done during morning meetings, closing meetings, or other community times during the day. In secondary settings, this can be done in a short session at the beginning of class before diving into the academic content of the day. It could also be done during advisory time. However, I would recommend both. We can also teach SEL implicitly. In this case, skills are embedded into academic lessons and taught indirectly through activities, discussions, and classwork that has an SEL component. In this case, CASEL competencies are used to build secondary objectives that can function as a guide for focusing instruction through an SEL lens. This gives students the opportunity to practice SEL skills within the context of their learning. One method that I enjoy using for integrating SEL into academics is through writing objectives explicitly for SEL alongside academic objectives and plans. This has a few advantages. First, it brings a level of intentionality into the process. The more you learn about SEL, the more you'll find that you're doing things in your classroom already that fall under at least one of the CASEL competencies. By intentionally writing objectives for SEL to accompany your lessons, you will add a new level of intention and focus on the skills that you're already naturally bringing into the classroom. This method also allows you to keep data for yourself so that you know what competencies and skills your students have practiced, what areas may need improvement, and track student progress in applying these skills. This is much simpler to do when you have information in the form of objectives of what skills you have already taught in the implicit method. Writing SEL objectives into your plans also allows you to be clear in your learning goals for your students. This clarifies the skills that students will need in order to be successful and helps to guide them in their understanding of how to learn effectively. Last, this process can be a reflective one that gives you a new perspective on the role of SEL in the classroom and why it is valuable for you to utilize CASEL competencies, whether you teach kindergarten, high school chemistry, or anything in between. Let's take a look at what an SEL objective might look like. Here we have an example of a possible 4th grade SEL objective. Students will demonstrate perspective-taking skills through writing a journal entry from the point of view of a main character in Esperanza Rising. This objective utilizes a reading standard as well as a writing standard for that lesson and can connect to 2 different competencies, responsible decision-making and/or social awareness. I built this objective by taking a few considerations into account. First, I asked myself what actions or activities the students are performing in this lesson. In this case, the students are evaluating a character's perspective to write a narrative from their point of view. This activity assesses a student's comprehension of the text as well as their ability to write a short narrative. But in clarifying that activity, I can see the connections to CASEL competencies, which leads me to the question of how my students are demonstrating mastery and what skills that demonstration connects to. I can also ask myself how my students are showing that they are progressing in this skill. The way that my students would write this narrative demonstrates to me how well they were able to see from that character's perspective and understand their point of view in a given situation. So, to break it down even more, we can look at it this way. First, we're identifying the academic standard and objective. Then, we're planning out the lesson with attention to learning activity and student moves. After that, we're connecting that to our CASEL competency before finally explicitly stating our SEL objective. Once you know the CASEL competencies, this process can take a matter of moments and adds very little planning to your load. In order to deepen our understanding of CASEL and academic content connections, I made a few handy-dandy slides to deepen our understanding. On each of these slides, you'll see a competency, the skills with that competency, and a list of activities that apply. These activities are in no way, shape, or form an exhaustive list. These are simply a few ideas that connect with the competency that I've used in my own classroom or have seen in other teachers using in observations. During this part of the presentation, I recommend that you pause after I explain each competency and list some activities. When you pause, I want you to write down a few things that you've done in your own classroom that connect with that competency. First, when we talk about self-awareness, the skills that we're covering cover things like identifying emotions, having an accurate self-perception, knowing your strengths, being self-confident, and having a sense of self-efficacy. Activities that build on these skills include having students reflect on classroom data to find areas of strength, learning and practicing presentation skills, reflecting on character emotions in a novel, identifying emotions around anxiety-inducing topics or events in the classroom. This one is specifically helpful in addressing test and performance anxiety. This would be a good time to pause and reflect on your own classroom if you'd like to do so. In self-management, we're covering skills like impulse control, stress management, self-discipline, self-motivation, goal setting, and organizational skills. These are all things that we clearly want our students to master if we want them to succeed in any classroom. Some activities that can connect to this include helping your students to learn and use a new note-taking method and giving them time to reflect on whether it was useful for them and what they would do differently. This is also a great place to cover test-taking skills, setting academic goals and making a plan to meet them, using an agenda to plan out your day and your studying time. Other things I've done in this realm include having students keep track of their motivations with a regular reflection on what was motivating in class, What did they struggle to get themselves going on because of a lack of motivation, and what strategies for motivation they could share with their peers. Next, we come to social awareness and relationship skills. These skills begin to move away from the internal work of self-awareness and self-management and bring students into their interactions with others in class and society at large. In social awareness, we work on things like perspective taking, empathy, appreciating diversity, and respecting others. In this area, we can connect to activities in which students are evaluating character choices, writing biographies, studying history from diverse perspectives and cultures. Debates are also a great way to practice perspective taking and respect for others, especially when topics are assigned and students are forced to look at an issue from a perspective other than one that they currently hold. When we enter into relationship skills, this is when we specifically cover communication, social engagement, relationship building, and teamwork. Some connection here may include any time students are working in small groups, creating group projects, performing interviews, or running a mock trial. They might also include creating proposals for projects in their community, making plans for improving the school, or writing a grant for a project they want to complete as a class. Part of the key here is the focus on how they're doing these things, how they're working together, and what that looks like, and improving the skills that help them to work together more effectively. Again, there are so many ways that each of these competencies fit into the activities that you already do. I really hope that you're pausing occasionally to write a few ideas of your own. Last, we have responsible decision making. This competency requires students to use both their internal skills covered in self-awareness and self-management, as well as their skills in interacting with others from social awareness and relationship skills. Responsible decision-making skills include identifying problems, analyzing situations, solving problems, evaluating, reflecting, and ethical responsibility. The first 5 skills listed here can all function together as a part of a decision-making process as students identify the problem they're dealing with, analyze all of the parts and aspects of it, solve the problem, evaluate the results, and reflect on their process. Some activity ideas here include things like simply reading math word problems with the purpose of understanding the problem presented in the situation. Science experiments also fall in this category, as do inquiry projects and studying government and law. The question of ethics falls under any academic area, especially when we teach students about the importance of citation, understanding how scientific studies are performed, evaluating the ethics of laws, and much more. Here are some examples of what SEL objectives can look like when paired with activities and academic standards. I won't bore you by reading all of them, but I'll go into depth with one, and you can pause the video to take more time with the rest. Let's look at the Grade 3 standard about demonstrating command of the English language. When you look at the full content and context of this standard in the Common Core State Standards website, then you can see that this standard also encompasses practical application of English language conventions, such as using commas in addresses. That inspired me to gear this activity towards having students write a cover letter for a job. This could be for a classroom job, a dream job that they have the goal of achieving, or anything else. The SEL side of this is that in this letter that is demonstrating the student's command of the conventions of English spelling, grammar, capitalization, and punctuation, they're also writing about their strengths and attributes that make them a good employee for a future job. This serves 2 functions in terms of CASEL. The first is recognizing strengths, a skill that lives in self-awareness. The second is goal setting, a skill that's a part of self-management. Here we have examples for grades 4 through high school. This time I'll dive into the middle school science example. In this standard from the NGSS, we see that students are tasked with developing and using a model to describe the law of conservation of mass. So for this activity, the students were asked to design an experiment that would demonstrate the conservation of mass through a chemical reaction. The SEL objective here then asks students to evaluate their experiment to determine whether or not their method addressed the posed problem. Knowing that the law of conservation of mass is a constant, if their experiment shows otherwise, then we know that the problem must have been in the experimental design, not the law. This forces students to evaluate their problem-solving method and work through their experiment again. In this way, they're working on responsible decision-making skills of identifying problems, analyzing situations, solving problems, evaluating, and reflecting. A teacher could easily also throw in ethical responsibility by discussing ethical considerations around experimental design to ensure the safety of students as well as the classroom, and agreeing that everyone has an ethical responsibility in a lab to ensure each other's safety. In our time together, we've covered some basic information about SEL and the CASEL competencies. We've also touched on the ways that we can teach SEL in the classroom, and I've provided you with a method for starting to bring CASEL competencies into practice. At the end of the day, though, if nothing else, I want you to leave with this understanding that there is time and value in including SEL in the classroom, because as Woodrow Wilson said, human nature is a thing far wider and richer than intellectual pursuits alone. As teachers, we must commit to developing the whole human if we want our students to succeed in school and in life. SEL is a key to that. I hope that you enjoyed your time with me today and that you found this information at least somewhat valuable. The BSS team is always excited to continue conversations around SEL. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to our team at bss@aps.edu or through Twitter at APSBSSteam. If you'd like to reach out to me personally, you can reach me at molly.keys@aps.edu. Please like, follow, subscribe, and have a really excellent day. Bye-bye.